What happened to you when you were young that you didn't understand until years later? Story 1. When I was about 4 or 5, we got two very important life changing bits of medical news. The first was my baby brother was on the way. The second was that my father was diagnosed with acute lymphoma and had about 2 weeks to live. When I was little, I had no grasp of how serious cancer was. My mom told me my dad was sick, but that was about it. I remember my mom kept insisting that I spend time with him, but I would always get angry when he got too tired to play or kick me out so he could vomit from the chemo. I remember one night in particular when my school had my first back to school night carnival. They had all sorts of rides and stuff. My dad just had extensive surgery and had staples across his entire neck. I used to joke that he was like Frankenstein. And my dad managed to make it through the big presentation the teacher made to the whole class and the parents, but barely. I thought this was boring, but would be worth sitting through because I would get to go on carnival rides afterward. But my dad had to leave. He couldn't even stand up. I could not understand how my strong 6'4" father could be so selfish. If he could sit through the boring part, why not the good part? I, to this day, feel tremendously guilty over how I treated him and the tantrum I threw when my mom was struggling to hold my dad up and my dad was struggling just to stay conscious. Fortunately, the doctors were wrong. He made it well past the 2 weeks and eventually beat cancer 5 years later. It took years before I understood how seriously sick he really was. He had gotten down to 90 pounds, but to me, he was still a superman. Story 2. I had recurring dreams of crying in the tub while someone threw water in my face from a very young age. I told my mom about it in my teenage years, and she told me that I had been raped by my babysitter's older son while being given a bath when I was 2. Sad story, but I feel pretty disconnected from that whole experience. It just feels like a bad dream. She was pretty torn about telling me. She started by saying it wasn't a dream, and I pressed her for more info, and she told me everything. She asked how I felt afterward and even offered to take me to my therapist again. There was no bluntness about it, but she tried to make it as clinical and straightforward as she could. That traumatic event wasn't just hard for me, but her as well. And so talking about it between the two of us as adults was actually relieving to both of us. Story 3. I was about 5 or 6 years old in a Caldor store, defunct discount Sears wannabe store in New England. My mom and I were on the second floor and I was a couple of steps behind her. I thought I saw her go down the escalator, so I did too to catch up. I couldn't find her. I looked around for a while fruitlessly. I was eventually approached by a lady who looked to be about 40 in a brown leather jacket. She asked if I was lost. She said she was a police officer and that my mom was outside. She led me toward the front entrance as my mom called for me from the second floor. I went to my mom. Unless I remembered some details incorrectly, I think I was about to get kidnapped. This fact occurred to me when I was about 20. Story 4. When I was 12, my divorced mother and I lived in a nice duplex in my hometown. She would go to the city after I fell asleep and party downtown with my aunt almost every night. I didn't know this until I was older. One night in particular, I fell asleep on the couch and halfway woke up to the sound of the front door opening and closing. I saw my mom walk in with a creepy, hooded, shadowy figure close behind her. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I asked my mom who was with her when she came home last night. She looked terribly confused. I told her about the figure behind her and the color drained out of her face. She shook her head and told me to stop playing games. That if I kept telling ghost stories, I would invite malevolent spirits into the house. Found out about a year ago that she brought a guy home and made me believe it was a ghost so I wouldn't tell my grandparents. Crafty. Story 5. When I was a teenager, my father was the biggest jerk who ever walked in the face of the earth. He never bought me video games for my birthday or Christmas. And I had to put almost all of my money I got from gifts and summer jobs into the infamous quote-unquote college fund. We were the last family on the block to get a touch-tone telephone, a computer, a printer, and a new television, and to this day, he still has a push mower for the lawn and television without cable channels, and he doesn't have high-speed internet. While other kids got to sleep in until noon on the weekends, I was always forced to get up at the crack of dawn and work on fixing something that was broken or needed maintenance. There was always something that needed working on during the weekend. The roof needed to be cleaned, the house needed painting, the trees needed to be trimmed, the sidewalk needed to be swept, the kitchen and bathroom needed to have plumbing work done and tiles replaced, and the whole house was always dusty, dirty, and in need of cleaning. I felt poor and overworked, and all my friends got their summers and weekends free to do whatever they wanted. Life was so unfair. Now I'm an adult, living on my own away from my parents. I'm still not fond of those childhood memories, but I also didn't have to take out a loan for college. I never worried about paying for college, field trips, gas, food, payments on our house, insurance, or clothes. Money just wasn't an issue for the essentials. I just missed out on some luxuries as a kid. I didn't get to be lazy during the summer weekends, but in the last few weeks, I have been able to replace the garbage disposal, paint the back wall, put in a new ground cover in the backyard, fix a broken drawer, and a number of other things. I learned all those things from my father, and I had enough money to pay for all those repairs without a second thought because he taught me the value of money for years and years. He seems less of a jerk to me now than when I was younger. Story 6. Carjacked with my cousin. I was 12, she was 16. Gun pointed at my head and everything. At the court hearing, they were caught. My lawyer person lady asked if I was aware that the 4 men who carjacked my cousin and I had an intention to kidnap us, as the police found duct tape and rope in their getaway car and they fessed up to it. That was a heavy bomb dropped on me while I was testifying against them, but I never really understood how lucky I was until I was older. You might ask why they changed their minds, and I've heard that the leader of the group decided against it because we reminded him of his kid sisters. Since it was technically my uncle's car and happened in my uncle's driveway, they were the ones responsible for pressing charges against the men who were pulled over for speeding down the freeway just as 2 detectives arrived to ask us questions. The car was totaled. Story 7. My dad was a fairly strict guy with a military background, very type A, the type, etc. I was a very outdoorsy tomboy of a girl. As a kid, I loved to find caterpillars and build little homes and find the best flowers for them to eat, and my dad loved this hobby of mine. So much so, he would encourage my caterpillar hunting, which I always thought seemed a little weird, but I didn't question it. There were a few plants out by our barbecue in the back that he specifically asked me to keep an eye on because, as he told me, this was the best place to find them. My kid brain just thought my dad and I had found a common ground and that he wanted to help. About 5 years later, as my naiveness started to wear off, I realized my dad was a total pothead. My brother, who was 10 years older than me, was chatting with me about my new realization one day, and that's when it was finally spelled out for me. Those plants that, according to my pops, were the best place to find my footed worm friends were actually just my dad's pot plants, and he enlisted my help to keep them bug-free. Story 8. In first grade, a girl in my class would always wear a dress to school, and the guy sitting next to me would always drop his pencil to take a peek. One day, the teacher caught him in the act and sent him to the school shrink. The guy went to a different school a week later. About a month later, the girl moved away. However, that guy ended up in the same high school as me. We ended up in the same gym class and got to talking. He told me that the girl was being raped by the father and he kept dropping his pencil to see the horror show of bleeding. He thought that's how girls were made. They chop off the wiener. He was genuinely curious to see when the bleeding stopped. He was just too scared to ask her directly about the chomping. After the school psych figured out he wasn't a peeping Tom, they called the cops on her dad. Story 9. Everything here is so down and dismal. Let's talk about some happy memories. When I was young, I think around 4 or 8, I idolized my brothers. Jack was the mature father figure with all the brains, Ben was the looks and the cool guy, and Peter was the rebel without a cause. Jack went to college when I was 4 years old, and it was hard to deal with as a kid that I was losing my best friend. I didn't understand why he had to leave home to go to school when he used to come home every day. Whenever he did visit, though, he always took time to goof around with me. My dad wasn't exactly capable of being fatherly, due in large part to alcohol, but he was around. Jack was basically my father figure growing up, and through him, I learned what it meant to be a good dad. He made time for me, even if it was just to fuck off and play video games for a whole day. He taught me some essential stuff like how to fish and how to be successful. I didn't realize it at the time, but he's the one who taught me how to be a man. My brother Ben was very much the same, to a lesser extent though. He spent a lot of time playing music, talking to girls, and playing video games. When my brother left, he took up the mantle of the father figure. He'd take me out to the mall, but we always wound up coincidentally meeting up with girls he knew. They'd gush over me. Hey, I was a damn handsome kid with baby blue eyes, who can blame them? And I watched my brother talk with them and take them around and show them a good time. I thought I was part of the gang. Nope. My brother was just using me as a chick magnet, and through that, I unknowingly learned to flirt and how to treat a girl. Ben also taught me how to chill like a pimp. We'd kick back, listen to some music, giggle like idiots at Ren and Stimpy, and play Legos for hours. He had a dog whistle on his keychain. I could never get it to make a noise when I blew on it, so I thought little of it. He'd clean that thing religiously after he went on walks. Without me, he needed some alone time. And right after he cleaned it, it was when we would goof around. We'd always had snacks. He taught me that when cups are dirty, the next best option was to use a bowl instead. I thought it was so cool. About 2 years ago, out of nowhere, I remember that dog whistle he had on his keychain. With the wisdom that could only be granted through age and a college degree in Maine, I deduced that the dog whistle was, in fact, a pipe he used to smoke on his walks. He was just extremely high for most of my childhood, as it turns out. Then there's Peter. I stick to what I said. He was a rebel without a cause. I'm talking about dyed blue punk spikes. He looked like a character out of SLC Punk. One time he got in trouble for drinking cranberry juice in the hallway. The student government kids could drink in the halls at their booth, so why can't he drink in the hallways? Well, the man came crashing down on him and slapped him with a solid sentence of 5 days of hard labor and in-school suspension. Peter dealt with it exactly like how a mature adult wouldn't. He bought a prison jumpsuit, dyed his hair neon orange, put chains around his wrists, and went into exile like a political revolutionary icon of the proletariat school body. I thought it was hilarious at the time, but when I got to his age, I felt the same way he did. Not everyone was treated the same, and it wasn't fair. I learned from Peter how not to deal with authority, though, so I joined the student senate and fought the man from the inside. Anyways, a lot of stuff happened when I was a kid that I didn't understand until later. It never occurred to me that it was all Jack just showing me how to be a man, Ben showing me how to enjoy life, or Peter showing me how to navigate a society I didn't like. I'm sitting here as a semi-successful person today because of them and everything I learned just by being around them. Oh, and one time I got scratched by a wild cat. I thought it was just a dick and that all animals love me. Nope, I didn't realize it at the time, but it's a law of nature that cats hate me. And for those wondering how my brothers fared in life after adolescence, Jack graduated college after switching majors. He pulled a straight 180 and went from anthropology to molecular biology, where he kicked so much ass it's hard to explain. He's now a PhD and just accepted a professorship. He married a wonderful woman who makes magic cookies bar, which live up to their name. Those things are God's gift to men. And they're expecting their first child in January. I'm so excited. What a boring, absurdly successful life path. Ben had a rough time in college. And when I say that, I mean he partied way too hardy and forgot to go to most of his classes. After GTFOing before the end of his third semester, he moved back in with my parents. He dated some crazy girl who looked like she would have hung out with Peter in his heydays, but it didn't work out. Ben went back to school where he obsessively did not screw up. I don't use that term lightly. He retook some classes because he only got a B. I remember once when he was the ladies' man lacrosse player in high school, a girl, Jen, used to follow him around all the time. They were friends, but outside of school, he avoided her like the plague from what I could tell. She frequently had me go fetch him while I rode my bike around our block. He would pretend he wasn't home, and so she resorted to calling, knowing my mother would pick up the phone and force him to talk to her. Except he often pawned the phone off onto me when my mom felt satisfied in her giddy eavesdropping. I very distinctly remember her telling me she had green toenails. That was so goddamn disgusting, even to nose-picking 6-year-old me. I understood why Ben didn't want to hang around her. Gangrene is gnarly. I guess because he totally didn't like her at all, ever, they got in a little tiff before graduation and stopped talking. Fast forward several years later, and Ben happens to see Jen at a bar. In a valiant effort to make up for lost time and probably relive his glory days, he goes up to her. Without warning, Jen freaks out that this ghost from her past came back to haunt her, and she blurts out the magic words that scared most men away. I have a kid. It failed miserably, so she was forced to retreat. My brother, probably hearing that sad Peanuts song in his head, sauntered away until one of Jen's friends intercepted him and gave him her number. This time, I had nothing to do with the phone call, so they progressed from calling each other to hanging out. Suddenly, my mom is babysitting Jen's daughter, and a couple of years later, he proposes. Jen's daughter doesn't have green toes, nor does Ben and Jen's daughter, Erin. I assume green toes are not hereditary, and Jen insists she must have painted her toes green, and I just misunderstood. Doubtful. Peter carried on his rebellious attitude after his hair grew out into a less absurd shade of brown. My mom was happy. Peter was cranky, but considering he decided not to go to college and support the banking industry through student loans, the motherfucker needed a job. I guess he wound up deciding that the best way to fight Big Brother was to pay taxes and vote. Over time, he became less and less punky and frankly became far more enjoyable to be around. At Jack's bachelor party, he saved 17-year-old me from looking like a gargantuan jackass by stopping me when I thought I could pick up an entire party of sorority girls while being sloppy drunk and chewing on a cigar in the middle of a campsite. No, Henry, you don't talk to girls when you're this drunk. Sage advice. Over time, he went full poser and decided to live his punk lifestyle vicariously through this bit of corporate propaganda. He now wears pastel-colored polo shirts, rocks an almost military haircut, and carries his bouncing 2-year-old twins in both arms, both of whom shake their butts to Tim Armstrong, so maybe Peter will end up teaching them everything he knows about gluing their hair into spikes and mohawks. Story 10. I hope I'm not late for the party. When I was about 6, 7-ish, I was looking for bugs in my backyard when I came across a super rare and badass praying mantis. Naturally, I scooped it up and put it in my bug container. Later on, I was looking for more bugs when I found yet another praying mantis. Lucky day. I was super excited and put it in the container with the other praying mantis. Both of them stood in there dead still and just kind of bobbed around like praying mantises do. I came back a few hours later and was appalled by what I found. The bigger mantis standing there as still as ever, right on top of a praying mantis's head and legs. I was super spooked. Was that mantis a killer? Did the smaller mantis fall apart or explode? What happened? It really weirded me out for a while. I'd say about 10 or so years later, I found out that the female mantis eats the male mantis after. I still don't know if I'm an accomplice to a murderer or a world-class wingman. Story 11. I'm 24 years old now, and I didn't realize what happened to my sister and me until about a year ago. We had a neighbor named Bob. Bob was in his 60s with a wife that was very ill. Bob was a nice man who had to take care of his wife who was pretty much dying. My mom trusted Bob, my sister trusted Bob, I trusted Bob. Bob would play games with us. We loved Bob. He would let us come over to his house once his wife was out for the evening. He would let us come over in the afternoon if his wife was asleep. Bob started playing a game with us called the slide game. My sister was about 5 and I was about 8. Bob's only rule was that we could not wear jeans when playing the game. He always talked about how he preferred soft shorts, like cheer shorts. Girls know. Well, Bob would let us sit on his face and slide down all the way to his lap over and over again. He would also make a motor sound, which to us made it more fun. He would breathe hot breath on us as well when we were in his mouth. I honestly didn't even realize this was bad in any way. My mom put a collage together for me a year ago, including a picture of Bob standing with my sister and me. A few memories flooded my head, and I was happy until I thought about this game and about how he literally my sister and I without us or my parents knowing. Children are just too innocent. Story 12. My parents' divorce. My mother suffers from bipolar disorder, and 20-plus years ago, the psychiatric community was fragmented in terms of how to properly medicate it. Without proper medication and good access to mental health, my mother was not only suicidal and constantly depressed, but she had a bad spending habit. During her bouts of mania, she would go on shopping sprees to the tune of $10,000, $20,000, buying all kinds of useless shit we didn't need and couldn't even afford. She put it all on credit cards. There were quite a few things growing up that I recall my dad loading bags and bags of shit into his pickup truck and carting my brother and me to the mall and standing in line for hours returning the stuff. When my dad finally had enough, he committed my mother and then filed for divorce. She threatened to kill herself if he ever left her. For many years, I had a great deal of animosity toward my dad because I thought he had abandoned my mom when she needed him the most. He did everything in his power to try and help her. Not that she didn't want the help, but nobody he took her to could get her on the right medication. I was well into my 20s before realizing he made the decision he thought was best for me and my brother, though he made a lot of mistakes on his own too. I guess I came to the understanding that my dad didn't want to take the chance that my mother's illness would cause irreparable damage to us.